Well, welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be here to open up the 9th George Graham Lecture, as well as to combine it with the centennial event. February is International Health Month, so I'm delighted to have the combination of these things. But you know, when I look at the lineup with a lecture delivered by Ben Caballero and with speeches by Keith West and Al Summer, I mean, this is really a triple header. It's really quite amazing. You know, these are people that not only are part of our living history, but really have helped set the agenda for nutrition and public health down the road. You know, this is really quite an occasion. So nutrition, I wanted to say, has really been a central part of both the School of Public Health and the department, really from, well, before the beginning of the department, but from the beginning of the school. You know, and we look back at our history, you know, in 1918, E.V. McCollum was brought here as the first chair of, I think, chemical hygiene it was called at the time. And you know, and he brought this notion of doing experimental nutrition work, but also to look at diet and health and disease. And I understand he brought a lot of vermin into this school as well through his rat work. But he also started us off looking at vitamins, vitamin A, B, and D, and so that's really you know, something that we have followed on for decades, really. You know, we've had so many luminaries that have come through here, from Bacon Chow and Bill Beisel and Carl Taylor and Bob Black. We have a great faculty here now as well, including Bob Black and Keith West and Laura Caulfield and Perul most recently as well, and I could name them all actually. But Ben has been an important part of that. Obviously, George Graham has been a central figure in the nutrition world in Hopkins, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more about him as well and the central role as he's played. We're going to hear more about Ben as well as from Ben, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but certainly he has played a role as a pioneer, not only in childhood obesity, but looking at the nutrition transition and how important that is in low and middle income countries. But I have to say, on a personal level, it's been delightful to know and to work with Ben. He's somebody who has had a great commitment to science and to children, as well as to this institution, and I have a great personal debt to the role that Ben has played in helping us navigate through some difficult times as well as great times, and have appreciated your wisdom and your skill in many aspects of your work beyond just the research. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. But I'm also excited to introduce Al Summer to lead us into more of this discussion. He is, of course, known for his visionary scientific work around vitamin A and its role in mortality or reducing mortality. But also the visionary work in terms of intellectual leadership and the impact that's had on public health programs, as well as organizational leadership and leading the school. So we have, as I said, I really think we have a triple header here today, and welcome Al to the stage to take us next. Thanks.
Thank you, David. We have so many speakers. I'm going to take 2 seconds because otherwise there won't be time for Ben to talk. As David said, this is part of the centenary celebration of the school, so it's terrific to have this lecture as a highlight of that. I was fortunate enough to know George Graham and be taught by George, both across the street and here on this side of the street. So it's with fondness that I look forward to a retailing of that, and I'm sure we'll hear a great deal more about George from Keith when he makes an introduction, as it does with Ben. And of course I was here when Ben was doing his sterling work. It started the Center for Human Nutrition. I wasn't here when E.V. McCollum discovered vitamin A in 1913, or vitamin D subsequently, but I certainly invoke his memory often, and as David alluded to, one of the reasons I do is not just because he discovered vitamin A, and that's my favorite vitamin, because, you know, Al begins with A and all that other stuff, but because, as David alluded to, he was somebody who not only was a great scientist, but was equally interested in the translation of scientific discovery into improving human health. And he literally spent years during the 30s and during the war, World War II, traveling the U.S. and trying to educate homemakers and people on how to feed their families a healthier diet. So he really wrapped up the whole package from basic science to translation to public health impact. So with that, let me turn over to someone who, in fact, was George's doctoral student, but did his thesis research with me, and now has an endowed chair, which I don't have. Keith Webb.
Well, thank you, Dean Sommer, and welcome to the 9th George Graham Lectureship. This is a special event in our nutrition calendar of the academic year because we bring in provocative speakers. We give honor to the legacy of George Graham and the things that he did, the way that he contributed to science, and the role that he played in our growth in human nutrition in this institution. I think I have a few slides. Is this mine? Yes, it is. I would like to, right at the outset, welcome Carol Graham, George's daughter, but a distinguished economist who has written widely on roles of happiness in the role of economy, of nations and societies, and really is a leading thinker in how economics affects health. So thank you for being here, Carol. And we wish the entire family was here, but if we have to have a representative of only one, you're it. I'd also like to welcome Mirta and Ben's offspring, children. They're not children anymore. Tanya and Martin, welcome. It's very nice to have you both here as well. A few words about George. He was a professor of pediatrics and international health. He was the founding director of the program in human nutrition about 40 years ago. He also was the founding director of the Institute of Nutrition in Lima, Peru, which today is one of South America's leading nutrition institutes, with which this department has collaborated and the school has collaborated regularly over the past 40 years. There are always studies going on with that institute, and we owe it to George for founding it. He held many appointments on advisory boards and consultative groups. He was a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Institutes of Health, the American Institute of Nutrition, which he loved dearly and contributed regularly. He had many awards, the Goldberger Award, the Borden Award, the Garcia Award. These are awards that are known in the world of nutrition. He was a scientist, he was a mentor, he was a teacher, and he was a prolific writer. Among his selected publications, he put copper deficiency into our scientific community as an essential nutrient. His studies of infantile malnutrition stand today as references for how children need to be fed in early infancy, how malnourished infants need to be rehabilitated, the importance of animal source protein to provide for the growth of children. He did many experiments on milk protein and various kinds of vegetable proteins compared to milk protein to see how well that preserved body composition and enabled children to grow. He did a lot of work on lactose intolerance, both in pregnancy and in children, and looked at cereal-based foods, which are the staple crops of the world. If you bring them into those crops into the diets of young children, how well does that preserve growth? He was a champion of protein quality, and that is beginning to come back. We haven't paid a lot of attention to protein quality in the past 25 years. And it is coming back into focus in terms of the importance of the quality of protein, the amino acid content of protein in preserving the growth of children. He was a he did early research on what we now call WASH, water and sanitation and hygiene, and we say it almost as a cliche. Oh, WASH is important. But 40 years ago, when George was working in the slums of Peru, he did studies on the importance of clean water and how that would improve growth of children. So he really was a leader in our institution in nutrition, and it's wonderful to have this lectureship in his honor. This picture was shown last week at one of our centennial events, and it is just a wonderful, wonderful picture because it captures the department's half century of leadership in our Department of International Health with Tim Baker and Carl Taylor and Bill Reinke sitting right there with Mel Thorne and Bob Parker and Al Buck and Matt Tapak and Alan Sorkin. And then, of course, we have Bob Black, who led the department for 27 years, I think it is. And our new department chairman over the past few years, David Peters, is sitting there thinking about how he's going to lead the department 15 years in the future. And of course, George is here amongst the leadership, and Matu Santosham has been a major leader in the department. And then this gentleman here is Nils Dallaire, who is a MPH student here in 1978, went on to become the Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services in charge of international health, and the U.S. Representative on the Executive Board of the World Health Organization, and who is our Cruz Family Alumnus Award awardee, and he'll be giving a talk here later this spring. When we think about leadership, we also had a few others in the interim. There was Ken Brown that followed after George Graham, and Laura, I asked for a picture and I forgot to put you. Laura, where are you? Please stand up. Laura Caulfield, who was a director of the program in human nutrition. You would have gone right below Matu, right there. So picture that. And then, of course, we have Ben, who's founded, who is not only director of the program in human nutrition, but the founder of the center. And some people get confused about what the program is and the center is. Well, the center is a broader body to encompass researchers and teachers and students and faculty from other parts of the Hopkins institution and outside of Hopkins down into collaborating institutions, for example, USDA, to bring a broader community together. It was Ben's vision to network faculty and researchers who are working in many aspects of nutrition into a center. And while they didn't get money, they brought loyalty and dedication and a commitment to collaborate together, and that has been a real contribution to our academic program over the years. We do have the George Graham Professorship that Al mentioned, that was started in 2005 through contributions of friends and family and institutions. That was launched, that was installed in 2005. I'm delighted to be the holder of that professorship. And we launched this lectureship in 2007, thanks to Mittendorf Foundation, the International Fund for Infant Nutrition, and Drs. T.C. and Mrs. Lee Wu, who have made generous contributions to this lectureship. George's legacy goes on. You'll see in the spring magazine of Johns Hopkins Magazine a small article on students who are carrying on the legacy of Hopkins leaders and faculty in international health. And Yuni Kang got her PhD in 2015. She's currently a postdoc in our program and has worked a great deal in Ethiopia trying to look for programmatic ways to deliver nutritious, protein-rich foods to help children grow. Where's Yuni? Please stand up. There she is. Thank you. We've had previous lecturers, Ken Brown, Bill McLean. In 2009, we had Nevin Scrimshaw and Carl Taylor on this stage sitting, bantering back and forth about nutrition, the interactions of nutrition and infection when they were thinking about this interaction in the 50s. And it led to a WHO monograph in 1969 on interactions of nutrition and infection, and that legacy has been carried through. Now this interaction is recognized as a major public health priority to understand and to deal with in public health. You can see them talk to each other on our website. The video, the YouTube is there. We've had Ricardo Owawi, Andrew Prentice, Michael Golden, Bruce Ames, and last year, in the 75th anniversary of the Dutch winter hunger, we had Bert Lume and Dick Hall. And Dick Hall is right here in the center. Thank you, Dick, for giving that presentation last year. It's wonderful to have you here. So that brings us to 2016. Whoever thought we'd survive 2016? We have Benjamin Caballero. And Ben is I think perhaps our newest emeritus professor. Just several months ago, he came here in the program in human nutrition, started the Center of Human Nutrition in 1990. He was our director for 15 years. He has worked widely across the spectrum of nutritional problems that affect especially children, well, children all the way to adults. The whole life cycle Ben has looked at, from undernutrition to obesity. He has held numerous appointments and advisory boards and expert panels, including many that we in nutrition recognize as the halls of authority in terms of nutrition. The Food Nutrition Board of the Institute of Medicine. He was on the expert panels of the dietary reference intakes, which guide our diet in the United States. He was on the Childhood Obesity Task Force, Scientific Advisory Board of the Food and Drug Administration, amongst a number of committees of the NIH. He's a member of the Spanish Academy of Nutritional Sciences, the American Society of Nutrition, a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine. He's had a number of awards. They're listed here. These are major awards. Ansel Keys is especially a very famous nutrition researcher that to have given a lecture in his name is a very special honor. Ben is the author of over 200 publications, and he is now known as Dr. Encyclopedia. Ben has led the development of the encyclopedias of human nutrition, food, sciences, and nutrition, and just this week, I believe, came out the Encyclopedia of Food and Health. And if you buy all of those, it takes a tree down, an entire tree. But these are volumes that will continue to guide our thinking in human nutrition around the world. I'd like to thank, because I often forget or I run out of time because I talk too much, Rhonda Skinner and Barb Verrier and Lauren Haney-Post and Katie Healy and Brandon Howard for their help in putting this lectureship together. And so, without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Caballero. I'd like to thank Google Maps for that map of Cuba. And Ben is going to talk on blindness, weight fluctuation, and chronic disease in Cuba, a 20-year natural experiment, which means that he's part of that. You know, he's aged very well over those 20 years. Presented by our funders, to whom we're very appreciative. Ben?
Thank you. Can we put my...
It's minimized, Ben.
You don't want to show those again.
No.
I know, this is a new panel. Look at all the buttons here. We don't want to turn it off.
I'll let you press the wrong one.
It's just minimized.
Oh, I see.
It's behind that.
So while we're getting those ready, let me also introduce our own dean, Michael Clegg, who's going to be presenting later on we won't tell them.
Right, thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Okay. It's a real pleasure being here for a number of reasons. First, I'm with all my colleagues with whom I have shared a lot of adventures in science and discovery. Some of my current colleagues have been my students or other people's students, and it's wonderful to see the transgenerational effects of some of our work and efforts. I have some connection with the Centennial in the sense that exactly 25 years ago, I was approached to come to Hopkins. I was at Harvard Medical School, enjoying the life at that time of and the salary of a clinical investigator. Things changed later. And I was very hesitant to come here. As I said yesterday, I was very committed to public health, but I didn't know it yet. So what is this public health and this hygiene also? I don't want to be a hygienist. So it really prompted me after coming one time and not being sure, and I think I came 4 times before making a decision, to look at the history. I said, what is this school? I knew, of course, the name. It was famous, but I didn't know the story behind it. So I learned that in 1916, of course, we all know that Abraham Flexner issued a report that really set the basis for modern medicine and public health. And the Rockefeller Foundation put up a big amount of money. I think at the time was like $6 million. It was an enormous amount of money 100 years ago, to set up a really scientifically based modern school of public health, the first of its kind in the world. There have been many institutes in Europe, of course, the School of Tropical Medicine in London, but not really a school of public health founded in a rigorous curriculum and with a strategy for career. At that time, there were several candidates that could compete for these funds to establish the first school. And obviously the candidates were Harvard, Columbia in New York, University of Pennsylvania, Hopkins, and also Washington University in St. Louis. So a site visit committee was set up with Rose, Flexner, and Green, Jerome Green, who was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, the founder. And they started by going to Boston, then New York, then Pennsylvania, and then they came to Hopkins. And Hopkins was in somewhat advantageous situation in one hand, but it was still building the medical school in many ways. So what it had was a weapon of mass construction, which was William Welch. And of course, Welch played a major role in convincing this committee of 3 people that this was the right place. At some point, the committee decided to cancel the visit to St. Louis, and the rumor started to circulate that they were making their mind leaning towards Hopkins. So this obviously alarmed very much the other competitors, and it prompted Charles Eliot, who was just stepping down as president of Harvard, to write a letter to the Rockefeller Foundation that said, the more I consider the project of placing the proposed Institute of Hygiene in Baltimore, the less suitable and expedient I find it. Johns Hopkins is a weak and small university compared with either Harvard or Columbia, and Baltimore is a provincial community compared to either Boston or New York. Now tell us what you really think. So, as we know, 100 years later, Hopkins got the grant and this school was built. But before that, Green felt he had to answer this letter from the president of Harvard. And he said, the conclusive factors seem to be, first, the unanimity of spirit and administration at Hopkins, and the perfect contentment of the staff with the conditions under which they work, as contrasted with the decentralization, disunity, and discontent at Harvard. So I'm sure Dean Clark may have issues with how content is the faculty today, but the reality is that in looking at this history, I say, I think I like this place. I don't know if 75 years later it will be the same, but certainly I can tell you 25 years after I came here that I have not known other institution where collegiality and collaboration is as strong as here at Hopkins. So William Welch is not here anymore, but we still have a weapon of mass construction, which is collegiality and collaboration. And I believe that with this weapon, we can continue to be at the top of the competition for another 100 years. So let's get then to the topic at hand. Everybody is in Cuba. I had called some people in Washington when I arrived. Oh, they're in Cuba. He's in Cuba. The mayor of DC is in Cuba. So everybody is in Cuba these days. But the situation was different when I first started going there in 1993, 94. It was the forbidden island. It was very difficult to get there. Certainly, it was not allowed for U.S. citizens to spend any money in the island. There were no flights directly from the U.S. for U.S. citizens. So it was a very difficult situation in terms of going there at all. And I had absolutely no plan to go there, since there are other great beaches in the Caribbean. Certainly, there's no need to go there. But I learned a lot about Cuba, and I think you will in the coming months and years because of the interest that is coming now. It's still a country of contrast. It has, as you can see, some technology legacy from the former Soviet Union with very traditional ways of agriculture, strong presence of tobacco. Even now, when there is a campaign to reduce smoking, tobacco is a major export and employment. And also is a country in the path of hurricanes. Almost every year, they have some destruction because of hurricane. This is, in 2007, a major destruction throughout the island. On top of that, they still endure 50 plus years of an economic embargo, which in spite of the progress that we see with the Obama administration, as an act of Congress is still in place and can only be removed by Congress. So it's still, in spite of all these difficulties that we all know from public health that Cuba has a lower infant mortality than the US, it has the same life expectancy and provides health care to all its citizens at $500 per capita per year. So there are many things, and I'm sure many of us agree that there are many things that we could explore and perhaps learn from this island. But the adventure started in 1991 when the first few cases of optic neuropathy were reported in the province of Pinar del Rio. And this is important because this is a tobacco area. The tobacco industry is heavily concentrated in Pinar del Rio at the westernmost part of the island. And that's where the cases began to appear, almost exclusively there, and then spread to the rest. In April of '93, the number of people affected by this type of blindness reached over 50,000. And at that point, the Cuban government asked the WHO to set up a committee to figure out what could be done for the epidemic. And that's when the WHO assembled the committee, and I was lucky enough, I guess because I was around and I spoke Spanish, that I was included as the nutrition expert. And I'll show you the composition of the committee. It was heavily leaning towards an infectious agent and a viral agent. So nutrition was obviously clear that it was a problem, but it was not the focus of the concern at that point. So in May, we spent most of the month in Cuba collecting data, and certainly when you are invited to go to look at an epidemic where 50,000 people are already blind, you are a little worried whether you'll come back blind. So in the first few days, there was a lot of worry until clearly, for reasons that I will explain, I at least became convinced that this was not a contagious disorder. So after a couple of months of intense activity at all levels, scientific, political, economic, nationwide vitamin supplementation program started in the island, and in the subsequent months, the epidemic subsided and was reversible. About 97% of the cases were reversible. Some were not, and we're not sure if this is part of the syndrome of the epidemic or it was because these were some misdiagnosed and these people were bound to become blind because of other reasons. As you see, the PAHO mission, Llano was the head as director, head promotion of PAHO, and it had Carlton Gaduszek, a Nobel laureate, because of his work in the Kuru disease, was there as one of the virologists, but there were two other virologists also present, so 3 virologists, and then a neuro-ophthalmologist and a nutritionist. So clearly, the WHO and the Cuban government thought that this was very likely a viral disease. An example of a case, one of the first few that we had a chance to examine directly, and this is a typical case of more than half of the patients in the epidemic. Male, middle-aged, smoker, heavy drinker, and started with blurred vision, photophobia, got prescription lenses, and then continues with peripheral neuropathy, weakness in the legs, fatigue, cramps, and loss of sensitivity. Eventually become severely blind, and another prominent factor was loss of weight. He was hospitalized and treated with multivitamins and a balanced diet, meaning enough diet, and responded favorably. There were thousands of these cases in the epidemic. The peripheral form before of the optic nerve involvement was, as I mentioned, fatigue, decreased strength in legs, burning soles, which is another sign of vitamin deficiency, aireflexia, impaired postural stability, and in some cases impaired sphincter function. So one of the first things you do in epidemic, and by the way, this was my crash course in epidemics. I knew close to nothing on epidemic, and I think the best way to learn is to be thrown in the middle of epidemic with enough experts around you that you clearly learn the old-fashioned way, which is doing and being explained what you do as you go. With the case definition came the first really filter of who really could count in this epidemic, and we found quickly that there were quite a number of false cases. In some cases, you start the questionnaire saying, when did you start losing sight? And they say, well, a month ago when I lost my glasses. So that was not the case. So one important contribution that we started quickly was try to identify exactly who was a case. And probably around 70% were real cases, the rest were false diagnoses. As I mentioned, the geographic distribution, you see here, this is Pinar del Rio, the tobacco area, and this is the most heavily affected throughout the epidemic, although then it spread to other parts of the island. That sub-island, this little island, was very important for the epidemic, is the youth island, Isla de la Juventud, and it's important because it's isolated from the rest of the country, and also because there is a big international youth center where leftist and communist youth from all over the world come to study and learn and exercise. It's like a Boy Scout international. That's when I first convinced myself that this was not communicable diseases, because these people live in barracks, 100 in each. They have lunch together, they spend a lot of time together, and when we got there, we found not one single case in this youth organization. It was highly unlikely that with the time that had passed, there wouldn't be any case or spread in some form. This is the evolution of the epidemic, and we arrived around here in April, and it was at the peak. That's when the total was reaching over 50,000. This is the predominant form was the optic, and then cases of the peripheral began to increase a little later on. There were initial theories of the epidemic. The Cuban government concluded that it was probably an infectious agent spread over the island by the CIA, and that explained why there were no cases in the Guantanamo province. The CIA thought there was an accident at the secret Cuban biological weapons plant, but people in the street thought it was, the epidemic was due to three factors: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it was clear that it had to do with nutrition, because the nutrition condition was deteriorating for several years when the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, stopped the subsidies and stopped buying sugar at the artificially high price and subsidizing other foods. And Cuba as an island imported almost half of its calories. So without these subsidies, it was impossible to sustain the level of energy intake of the population. So the intake began to decline, and that's one of the interesting phenomena that prompted some of the interpretation of this epidemic. Because this is a natural experiment, data sources, we look for all possible data sources. There was no randomized trial here, not even a simple placebo study. Fidel Castro, who was very involved in this work, did not agree with any type of placebo. Once we agreed to give vitamins, he wanted to give to everybody. So there was not a chance to really prove this in depth, but we did have a number of sources, some international, like FAO balance sheets, others from national regular surveillance data from the government, our own data collection of the PAHO WHO expert mission. Then there was a Cuban epidemic neuropathy field team that was composed by the government and also by people from the CDC. And it's obvious that the US government contributed enormously to this effort, sending people from the CDC, from NIH, and also receiving any sample that we wanted to analyze. So in all, the data sources that we had were pretty reliable, many based on international studies and consistent with the surveillance systems that were in place for a number of years. One of the things that I already mentioned is the age range, and you see here in Cienfuegos province, the typical age range was 20 to 40 to 60, so we're middle-aged person. There were very few young people affected, and there were so few children that I think I saw them all. As a pediatrician, they sent me, there's a pediatric case in such and such hospital, I would see it, and in general were false cases, were children who were malingering or were convinced that they had some problems in their legs, use a peripheral, but essentially very few cases. There were no pregnant cases and very few cases of older people. And this is all consistent with the system in Cuba where pregnant women, young children, and the elderly have food and they have an ID card that allows them to go to special restaurants to receive food. Also they received a ration that is has been more preserved than ration of other people. And then, for example, to give you an idea, this case control study in Pinar del Rio, eye findings, 44 mean age and this different case control, no difference in the mean age and case control. All the other differences are statistically significant. Mostly people working in agriculture, a lot of them with deteriorated visual acuity, some severe. This test of retinal function impaired in a large number of people, impaired in visual fields, impaired in control sensitivity, and deteriorated color vision as well. So this was the typical picture of the ocular findings. In terms of the peripheral findings, decreased auditory activity, proprioception in arms and legs, decreased strength, areflexia, and abnormal sensitivity, vibrotactile and thermal, and diminished grip strength, both in men and women. Cigar smoking and cigarette smoking as well, but cigarette smoking, which is very common in rural areas, was a major risk factor here. Odds ratio for smoking over 4 a day was 22. So clearly, smoking was one significant factor. Another way to look at this was look at how many of the people who were controlled had intake below 50% of recommendation relative to cases. And the odds ratio, I showed this here to see that this was obviously a whole dietary problem. It was not deficiency of 1 or 2 vitamins. It was just not enough food. And so a lot of the vitamins were impacted, some more than others, but clearly throughout the spectrum of essential nutrients. In Cienfuegos, where our collaborator Pedro Ordúñez was director of the hospital, and we have a lot of good data from this province, which is in the center of Cuba, because it's part of the Carmen International Study. You see here, between 1991-93, the critical time of this special period that they call the decline in energy and protein availability from a state-provided food declined tremendously. And if we look at some of the key nutrients involved in the epidemic, B1, B6, B12 happens the same. Folic acid, the same. Dramatic drop. So everybody was getting much less of these vitamins. The other phenomenon, of course, is, as I mentioned before, during this critical period, I put here the 90 to 95, but really the critical period is 91 to 94. Energy intake dropped dramatically. There was less food, people were eating less. But at the same time, physical activity went up a lot. And that's because there was no oil. Import of oil almost stopped. So the government, with some donation from China and other countries, secured about 2 million bicycles and distributed bicycles to people so they could go to work. The bus were stripped of all seats, and they were placed in uphills so they could load cyclists to take, not too able cycles to the hill so they could continue. And they will do this back and forth all day, helping older people or people who are not fit enough to go up to continue their journey in bicycle. So physical activity went up and intake went down. This is a classical energy balance that we all studied. And the result was, of course, a tremendous decline in the rate of obesity. The rate of obesity was not big like here. We are talking in the 90s. It was about, this is the change in the distribution of BMI. And I show this is in the whole province of Cienfuegos. The interesting thing is that it's not just the cases with the disease, with the optic or peripheral neuropathy. The whole population was losing some weight. And I remember going with the ministers and with the directors of hospital very proudly showing me the new hole they had to make in their belts. See, this hole I made a month ago, and now I had to make another one. And when you share food with them, you could tell that it was a clear shortage that affected the whole population. Obviously, a few developed the neuropathy, but a lot of people lost some weight. So this is a change in distribution that is quite unusual to see at the country level, 9 million people. So as I mentioned, obesity prevalence went down during this period, and clearly this is related to simply weight loss. So going back to the etiology, we collected a number of samples, and the virologists collected many, many samples. And since there was a leaning toward this was investigated right away. And we had a Nobel Prize expert in neurovirus, so this was dealt with very quickly. Most of the findings were indirect, like having a cytopathogenic effect by culturing cerebrospinal fluid of cases and so on. But there were two critical factors that were against it. One was the mechanism of transmissibility was not evident. There were almost no cases in military barracks, for example. Why? Because the soldiers were eating well. And the cerebrospinal fluid, even if it infected the cells in vitro, was normal. Albumin was normal, glucose was normal. So the Nobel Prize quickly ended the discussion by saying, if this is a viral disease with normal CSF, we had to rewrite the past 100 years of immunology. And then they shut the door and went back to the US. And that's what the end of the viral hypothesis. The other etiology was discussed is toxins, and these were more elements here because methanol, as you know, is a byproduct of rum, and as the economic situation deteriorated, people began to do home brew rum. And obviously the purity is less, so indeed the methanol levels in several samples were higher, but not high enough. Was higher than the accepted in the industry, but it turns out that the Cuban regulations are much more stringent than international regulations. So even being above the Cuban level doesn't mean that that is a toxic rum. So maybe exposure increased a little bit, but did not explain the whole picture. Cyanide from tobacco always has been there. There was no increase in smoking, particularly those times. Cassava is not as heavily consumed as in other countries, and it was not increased. And then pesticides also, we couldn't find any change in pesticide use, and also the physiopathology related to the symptoms of the epidemic. So our hypothesis is a nutritional plus toxic etiology, and when we divide to write the report, I wrote this, and the report finally reflected this hypothesis, that it was a combination of decline in nutritional power to detoxify substances with the habitual exposure, but with insufficient agents to clean out that exposure. So it's not that there was more methanol or more cyanide in the tobacco, but there was less of the critical vitamins used to detoxify this. And to explain this very quickly, I'm not going to do a biochemistry lecture, but you see in blue, they are the toxins that are related. Formic acid is a derivative of methanol, and is metabolized, incorporated into this cycle where folic acid is the donor of methyl. Cyanide is metabolized by this pathway from cysteine that also is generated by a pathway that requires twice B6 as a cofactor of the enzymes. And then, of course, methionine is one of the major methyl donors in our diet, and a lot of methylation reactions. Methylation is one way that we detoxify many toxins. The problem with methionine is that one of the things that the government did when they had less and less resources to buy food, they began to buy soy. Soy is a good protein. It's an excellent protein, but it's the amino acid, the limiting amino acid of soy is methionine. And so by international standards, it has to be fortified with methionine when it is for human consumption. And of course, the methionine that is bought in a shady corner in Asia may not be fortified, and it's cheaper. So we didn't have a chance to measure this, but the likelihood that all these different sources that the government was sourcing to buy cheap protein, probably the consumption of soy went up, and soy that was not fortified. So in any case, the offer of methyl groups may have been diminished in the population. So all these fit with the plausibility and the biological causality, all the things that we look in trying to explain an epidemic. Of course, the connection between neuropathies and vitamins had been known for years, and in fact, one of the colleagues in the team, Dr. Gustavo Roman, had a book called Tropical Neuropathies, and that was his specialty, and we learned a lot through him of how different vitamins are many times a critical factor in manifestation of these neuropathies. Some peculiarities of the Cuban epidemic was that impacted rapidly on an otherwise healthy population. And we compare with other situations where food is scarce, and many times these are refugee camps or victims of natural disaster in which there is a protracted deterioration of the nutritional conditions, sometimes affected not just for the reduction in food availability, but also because of infections and environmental problems, which did not exist here. Universal access to primary health care, the protection that I mentioned for children, pregnant women, and the elderly, and a centralized healthcare system that allow quickly decisions, particularly the involvement, direct involvement of Fidel Castro, as I will mention, made that things happen very quickly. In the end, the epidemic decline, we don't have hard data showing, as I say, randomized trial or something like that, but the epidemic began to subside after a massive vitamin supplementation program started. There were massive donation of vitamins from Scandinavian countries, Sweden, and others, and this was distributed quickly to the population. There was a socio-political response to food scarcity. The government sent thousands of soldiers to plant gardens, vegetable gardens in every house. If you have a little patch of land, the soldiers would come and plant it for you, and other volunteers would take care of it. So generate, going back to subsistence agriculture, but really generating healthier components of the diet very quickly. Certainly, there was this biological adaptation. This lasted 4 or 5 years. And then, of course, as the epidemic goes, the people who are susceptible to this situation become ill, and those left are those who are resistant for some reason. A number of treatments were treated. It was interesting. It was not done in a systematic way as a study, but every hospital we would go, the director or some physician there would try some new method. This is magnetotherapy. It's a zap the eyes with the magnetic waves. And some of these things come from the Soviet medicine. Many doctors trained in the Soviet Union in the past, and they bring some of these approaches that are not common in Western countries. But also interesting, some of these techniques remain because the government made profit from them through medical tourism. So some of these alternative therapies, people can go, particularly if they don't go from the US, they can go and have beautiful beaches, good hostel and food, and get some of these therapies that are not allowed or are not available in other countries. From the beginning, we were in the field. We got up at 5, 6 in the morning, go to a military plane or helicopter, and went to a town and start looking house by house, the typical epidemic surveillance when you try to understand what is there. We took samples, measured people, do surveys, etc. So it was very involved. The other peculiarity of this, as I mentioned, was the involvement of the president, Fidel Castro. When we arrived at the airport, the team of 5, 6 people, we were taken, after a press conference there, directly to a meeting with Fidel Castro and the 50 scientists. There was this task force that the government has assembled with different specialists. And Fidel Castro appeared, shook our hands, thank you for coming, and I thought he was going to leave. But he stayed there in the front row for 4 hours, asking questions, and he's a obsessed micromanager, but certainly it's good to have one of these when you are looking at making progress quickly. I always like, yes, I like to put captions to this photo. He's saying, "Get out of my island," and I'm saying, "You're talking to me?" So maybe some other day. So we established a rapport that was very peculiar because we will be all day taking samples, visiting, come back in our plane or truck or whatever, exhausted at 5, 6, have something to eat, and at 9, Fidel Castro will come every night to talk with us and see the progress. And this was not a protocol visit, it was several hours, sometimes 3, 4 in the morning. You know that Fidel Castro is famous for talking forever. And he would come with the ministers, and the ministers had developed a tremendous skill to appear awake while they were, sleeping. And this is makes a big difference because, for example, and the ophthalmologists here know very well that one of the tests for contrast sensitivity is this glossy photo of circles from white to black and all the shades of gray, and depending where you stop distinguishing, that is a diagnosis. So we have a few of those, and we need thousands of these to give to people to do the diagnosis. And you cannot do photocopies of that. You need high-quality glossy paper, photographic paper. So Sadun, which you know, who was part of this, he saw some of these and said, well, we need 2,000 of these. It costs $100 each. It's impossible. It would take weeks to import them. And Fidel Castro said, can I borrow one? Sure. And the next evening when he came, he put 2. He said, can you distinguish which one you gave me and which one I did? No. So the next day we had 2,000 of these done. So that's it. I tried to put him in my translator, but it didn't work out. So this is Dr. Gaduchek, the Nobel laureate, who left quickly after saying this is not a virus. And this is Dr. Llano from PAHO, and this is Gustavo Roman, the expert in tropical neuropathies. So it was a really good team. At the end, we presented a report. The opinion of the expert committee was that this was a nutritional toxical interaction, that there were deficiencies of key nutrients needed to detoxify from common toxins that people have been consuming for a while. This was published in the Granma, the official newspaper of the Cuban Communist Party. Just by coincidence, they put a picture of me, but I got nothing to do with this. But I want to show this phrase They says, in spite of not having found clinical evidence of nutritional deficiencies that by themselves could explain the etiology of the epidemic, etc., etc. So our report was translated a little bit for the press as, well, we don't know really what it is. There's no evidence directly linking the nutritional deficiency with the epidemic. That may be true in some sense, but clearly the only thing that changed was the diet, and when vitamins were provided, things got better. So I am convinced that this was the combination, but politics has their own needs. Dr. Roman wrote a book, I don't know if it's available in English also, that has a narrative of this like a thriller, like if it was, James Bond going there, but it's interesting. The other thing that we discovered, thanks to some great colleagues in Cuba, is that this is the second amblyopia of this kind in Cuba. The first one was exactly 100 years earlier, when the US blockaded Cuba for the first time. And that was a military blockade on the war against Spain. I'm not going to go through the chronology, but as you know, the US was in a war with Spain, took the Philippines and so on. And then while Spain was waging war against Cuba, the Maine blew up, so the Navy did a blockade of the island, and as a result, not so much of the blockade, but what Spain had done before was to intern all the peasants and ban them, prohibiting them from harvesting. There was a deficiency, and this deficiency was published in two papers in 1898 and 1900, and the titles is fantastic. Notes on a sensitive form of peripheral neuritis and amblyopia by retrobulbar optic neuritis. I don't know exactly what they mean, but they mean these people are going blind and have peripheral neuropathy. The other, amblyopia by peripheral neuritis caused by autointoxication, wherever that is, due to defective alimentation. So they linked to nutritional deficiencies in the diet, and the symptoms were exactly the same, 100 years apart. So we published this in the American Journal of Public Health. Was an interesting comparison. Now, the follow-up on the response to weight loss. During this critical period, 1990 to 95, there was a lot of weight loss. So after all was done, and thanks to the good relationship that we had with the scientists in Cuba, the Minister of Health, and the President himself, we were able to go back and look in more detail at this weight loss and associate it with comorbidities associated with excess weight. And as I mentioned before, in 1995, at the end of the period, there was a substantial decline in the distribution of BMI. By 2001, this had been recovered and then some. And by 2011, there was another big displacement. So to see the black is the pre-epidemic distribution of BMI in the population. This was the shift to the left after 91, 95, and then the recovery on subsequent years. So the population recovered very quickly after 94, 95 for a number of measures, including global assistance from European countries as well as from the US. So they have quick access to food. And this is quite different from other famines, like the Dutch famine and other famines where, if you go in Europe, many countries, even the early 50s, they were still rationing in many countries. It was not a quick recovery because all the world had troubled. The US because of the war effort and Europe because it was devastated. Whereas here, these 9 million people, they receive a lot of recovery calories and help very quickly. So energy intake went up tremendously. Remember, we left them here in 95, and by 2010, the energy available and in intake was higher than even before. Physical activity, on the other hand, began to decline as more motorized transportation became available. So we have here again the energy imbalance, but in opposite direction. So obviously, obesity went up and continued to go up. And this is the other difference with the Dutch famine and other situations. In the Dutch famine, when they began to recover of the famine, they were in a world, the world outside was also suffering from limited intake of energy. Whereas when this population here woke up to recovery, they were in a world of obesity. There was obesity everywhere. There were high energy food everywhere. Many of the foods donated were high energy, high density foods. So they recovered in an environment of prevalent obesity as opposed to a recovery of post-war slow rehabilitation. If we leave this obesity trend in the background and we look at diabetes incidence, it's remarkable how it tracks the trends of obesity. Obesity goes down and diabetes incidence goes down. If the person who is obese lost some weight, the risk of becoming insulin resistant and then diabetic type 2 is reduced. So this is a very clear overlap of trends. In terms of mortality, there was a delay, but clearly, as a consequence of less cases, there was also a reduction in diabetes mortality. If we looked at coronary heart disease mortality, there was also a continuing reduction even when BMI started to go up. We didn't find any difference in cancer trends, but we did find some decrease, moderate but clearly visible, on stroke. So this change in body weight from decline during the special period had a lasting effect for the next several years, and later, of course, all these trends began to reverse as obesity became more and more prevalent. Other consequences, there was an increase in the prevalence of low birth weight, and just before this opening to Cuba, we were planning to look at the children born during that period, special period, because these children, we know a lot about what happened in pregnancy during energy restriction from past cohorts, but we don't know what happens when these children are born and are quickly put in an abundance of calories, obesogenic environment very quickly, if it is an effect that one can detect very quickly. There was an increase in the age of menarche, all these things associated with a severe caloric restriction. Now, if we look at this difference here, it's about 4 points of BMI, is a little less than 4 kilos. So what this population did, basically, the majority of the population went to Weight Watcher and graduated with success. They lost 8-9 pounds over a period of years and sustained this for a while. So this is a very interesting comparison with what happened, for example, in the US on the reverse side, where we have also about 4 points BMI between the enhanced 7680 and 2006. And this is sufficient to increase the rate of a number of comorbidities that we know very well. And then there are subsequent Hopkins Cuban activities. So we kept working on this. We kept going back and looking at data, but also we have some activities related to Hopkins, and Al has been involved in this. As always, has been a great supporter of some of these things, because for the students and for our knowledge, it's very important. One was the visit of the then Minister of Health, Dr. Carlos Dotres, and this is interesting because Dr. Dotres was coming to the Pan American Health Organization Assembly, and for this he gets a visa. It allows him to go to Washington. He cannot cross the Beltway. So we had to do some maneuver to trick our GPS in thinking that Baltimore was DuPont Circle, and we got him here, and he gave a great talk, and then Al hosted him for lunch, and he talked with the students. For the students, it was a great experience to have a Minister of Health of Cuba with such a different system. Then there were a number of fellowships for young Cuban scientists. Some of the colleagues who collaborated with me in Cuba and collecting data, and others that were from key institutes of research in Cuba. And this was funded by external sources. It turns out that Vagelos, the owner of the Orioles, is a friend of Cuba. And Baltimore is a sister city with Havana. Go figure. So, and baseball is very popular in Cuba, so the Orioles would go as a, to promote friendship across countries, and so he was a great supporter of some of these activities. And then finally we did an undergraduate course, primary health care in a socialist country. We took 12 students, from senior students who were interested in public health and medicine, took them to Cuba for 3 weeks and showed them all the stages of the healthcare system, from the block guardian that visits everybody who is ill in the block, to the prevention committee, to the local clinic, all the way to the private luxury medical tourism clinics. This was a great experience, and why this happened in Homewood and not here is not my fault. Before you say anything, is that the architect of all this was a guy you may know, Wayne Smith. Wayne Smith was the last diplomat in Cuba before the U.S. closed its embassy in '91, and he went back later as chief of mission, where there was no high-level relations. And he created the Cuba Hopkins exchange program. And soon after the epidemic, I came back. He discovered me, and then I joined this program as well. And he managed to get funds to do this course. So for several years, we would go there with students, and it's gratifying that many of these students came to public health. Later years, I saw them doing their PhD or studying public health in different areas, because in part, I'm sure, by this motivation. So this is in the School of Medicine in Havana, a group of these students. We were housed in the Ministry of Health, which is a 24-story building. The top 4 are housing for students. So this was the view from my dorm. It's beautiful. This is the Malecon. And this is the U.S. Embassy, which now is open again. This is Almejeiras, one of the flagship hospitals in Havana, cardiovascular centers, undergrads playing doctors. And this was one of the last cohorts that we went with Dr. Patricia Paredes, who was our counterpart, who was great in organizing all the visits, and also gave free salsa lessons in the afternoon. So complete, and a great farewell party. We published quite a few papers on this, and I was thinking that from '94 to 2013, the last paper was in 2013, we published quite a bit of paper. There are 2 names that are in all these papers: Dr. Ordóñez, who is now a PAHO regional advisor, and mine. So if you look for my name and Cuba, you will find all these papers. I want to get to, I talked already at the PAHO mission, other teams that were there. Alfredo Sadun, which Al knows very well, was a great help as a neurostalmologist, and he had a lot of equipment that was not available locally. James Martone from Project Orbis was also there, and then people from the CDC. And there were a number of groups and missions, and some of them were self-appointed or were there. I remember once coming out of a meeting and finding Michael Latham, that many of you know. Michael Latham was, what are you doing here? I came to look at the epidemic. So there were a lot of people. And one of the things that I found is that most of these groups, we had no boundaries. We shared every data. We divided the work. So really very collegial, considering the circumstances. And then the collaborators were the people who really got to think about these things and try to produce papers and so on. Pedro Ordóñez, who was for many years director of Cienfuegos Hospital, a very special high-quality hospital in one of the central provinces. Javier Nieto, who was the faculty here, many of you know him, he's now in Madison. Alfredo Sadun, who came with other team, but we ended up collaborating for a number of years. Then Manuel Franco, who was the graduate student here, and he was one of the motors of this. He was doing a research in Baltimore in food availability. I was co-advisor with Fred Brancati, so I asked first Fred, would you mind if I send him to Cuba? And then I asked Manuel if he wanted to go to Cuba for a month to start collecting data with the connection. And of course, he's a Spanish citizen, so he had no problem in getting to Cuba. And he started the first data collection with our colleagues there. Usama Bilal, who is now a graduate student in epidemiology, started with Manuel in Madrid and now is here. And then Mariana Lazo, Eliseo Gualiar, I see Mariana there. All people who very generously donated their time to help us analyze data sometimes that was above our pay grade. We incorporated Richard Cooper and Swan Kennelly also to look at aspects of cardiovascular epidemiology that were not available, and because they had a lot of experience in Caribbean issues related to cardiovascular health and hypertension. And then the people in Cuba, which these names don't sound familiar for you except the last one, but these people really were very, very committed. Anything we asked, they supported, but not just during the epidemic, but even years later. And I say the continued presence and involvement of Fidel Castro was also a very special situation, because even if he didn't do something, some people had the suspicion that if they didn't help you, the comandante may find out. So I played this elegantly in order to get a lot of things, but people were really very committed to help advance the science and publication, not just resolve the problem. And this is it. And now I'll say what happened with Cuba. Now there is a big opening, and there are going to be a lot of business people and other people going to Cuba. Obviously, on the one hand, there is a lot of deficiencies in quality of life in Cuba. Simply, you see the cars from 50 years old and many other things that could be improved, transportation, industry, etc. But also, there are a lot of things that can go worse. Cuba, as I said, had a system that is very efficient and maintains very high standards of primary care. If we go there to advertise some of the healthcare plans that are in discussion among our politicians, it's not going to be good to Cuba. On the other hand, we also have our problems that we could look at Cuba, how they resolve it, because it's not that we have resolved problems. Our disparity is getting worse. I had a slide that I decided to remove of the 24 countries of the OECD, the developed countries. We are last in poverty in children. So the number of children living in households below the poverty level, the OECD defines 50% of the mean salary of the country. We are last. So we have things that we could look at countries that resolve with much less resources, but access to primary health care resources. So my wish is that we go with an open mind and see what we can learn. And I also have the example of oral rehydration, which is something developed apparently because they couldn't afford parenteral hydration in Bangladesh or India. They had to resort to this lesser method. And it turns out that years later, this simple, efficient method was adopted by the American Academy of Pediatrics as the treatment of choice for mild to moderate dehydration in children. So there are not many examples of reverse technology transfer, but certainly I believe that Cuba is one of the places where we can find many of these resources. And I hope this takes place in the future, and look forward to seeing part of it in coming years. Thank you very much.
One of the most important things early on in that was you're bringing back boxes of cigars from major donors to the school. I don't know how you left that out of the talk.
I wasn't sure it was legit, but indeed, indeed, and it was interesting going always through Miami. I never went through circuitous route. I always went through Miami, and with the students and everything, we had to go to a lot of hurdles to do that, but also Hopkins as an institution had to have a license from the Treasury Department to operate with Cuba for academic reasons. And one president, his middle initial is W, decided that he wanted to tighten the screw, and then he defined an academic mission as anything that lasts at least 3 months. So anything that was less than 3 months could not be academic, intellectual. unless it was religious. That's another story. But so we had this course that lasted 3 weeks, and we say, well, now we are screwed. And we decided to test whether this was enforceable. So I went alone and stayed there for 5-6 days doing something else and came back. And the price was very simple. In Miami, they will detain you until you lost your connection to Baltimore. So they left you stranded at the airport and they said, have a nice day. But of course, the other thing they achieved with that is that the journalists that we advised, told in advance, they got bored and they left. So when finally you were let go, there was nobody there to say something. So it was interesting aspects of going and coming to Cuba.
Well, as somebody, I've just finished a bunch of research on inequality of well-being in the United States, and I thought I was the only crazy person suggesting that we look at Latin America for preventive health and other kinds of social welfare programs in the conclusion, so I'm glad to hear you. I have a question looking at the post-famine health trends, and there's some improvements. And as in the dismal science, we always worry about unobservables. Do you know anything about what happened, any reactions in terms of the toxin use, tobacco use, other things? I mean, how well known was it that these things were interacting with malnutrition sort of publicly? Is there any data on what happened to, say, smoking or
Yes, well,
love drinking? Or
one issue was that there was a toxicologist in the mission who got ill or got scared, I don't know. He didn't come. So we didn't have, an international expert. But there were local experts who did a reasonable work in sampling. And that's from where we get that there was no really change in the exposure that had been going on for years, maybe a little increase in homemade rum, but not enough to say this is the main cause.
No, but after, as a response, was there any kind of decrease in use of toxins? Or
No, I don't think so. Fidel Castro at some point made a big public thing of quitting smoking, and all the ministers and everyone quit smoking, and most of the cigars are for export. But in the rural areas that we saw, almost everybody smoked. I didn't see any change.
Ben, has there been any other example of a neuritis epidemic elsewhere? There are lots of examples of food decline over the years for various reasons, due to pre-famine, famine.
Yeah. Yes.
Are there other examples that parallel what happened
Well,
in Cuba?
not parallel. That's why it is so unique. But certainly, Dr. Roman has a book called Tropical Neuropathies, and many of these are related to some of these deficiencies, thiamine, B12, B6, so very similar in terms of mechanisms, but are in really poor populations, very, very marginalized populations in the Caribbean. This peculiar thing is that this population was pretty healthy until this happened, and very quickly got into this deterioration and quickly came out again. I think that's unique.
Go ahead, Lily, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, the question is that during the post-special period, you talked about the vitamins that came in and the gardens with the soldiers. What about the economic situation? What changed there? And was it aid or was it from within?
No, there were major changes, and that was kind of the beginning of the end of pure socialism, because the government relaxed a number of rules about private ownership, about circulation of foreign currency. So they really began the industry tourism, the tourism industry that was already there, but it really expanded tremendously after this crisis, where the government allowed partnership primarily with European companies. And now you have wonderful hotels all over Havana, not only in the beach, but in cities like Cienfuegos and others, because of this change. So the government really began to change the economic policy. It had no choice, because before they could be very strict socialists with huge $2 billion a year support from the Soviet Union. Without that support, they had to change, and they did.
One more, Ingrid, or and then we'll take one more after that. Go ahead.
Thank you. I wasn't sure I understood this correctly, that, are you saying that there's two ways that malnutrition was leading to the neuropathy? Are you saying it was that micronutrients were deficient, such as thiamine or yet to be determined nutrients, and that also the toxic exposure was going up because the fat cells were, as they were starving, the fat cells were releasing the toxins that they would otherwise be holding on to, so that the toxic exposure that had been there for years was being released?
Yeah. I'm not sure that, I know about pesticides, this weight loss and fat loss is very important, because many of the pesticides are stored in adipose tissue. I don't think in terms of methanol you have that issue, because methanol is a very small molecule. Formic acid enters in this, and if it doesn't enter, it's eliminated. It could be toxic because it concentrates, but then it's also eliminated, but after causing some damage. So I think the key factor there is less food, and then some nutrients that in particular are related to the habitual environmental exposure of these people, cyanide, methanol, and that's why the key vitamins are those related to that pathways that I mentioned. The treatment was multivitamins, because that was available, and also because it's the people who don't eat enough food, they probably need most of the vitamins anyways. But the fact that they responded, I think, was more likely due to these particular vitamins.
So Ben, was the vision loss totally reversible? Was there any residual vision
As
loss?
I said, 97% of the cases in a report that the Ministry of Health issued about a year after all this ended was reversible. And what is not clear is the non-reversible were not described in detail. So one possibility is that there were false cases. There were, other type of organic damage not related to this mechanism. And the other is that in some cases people spend, 1, 2 years. This started in '91, and I'm talking about end of '93, middle of '93, beginning supplementation. So people who were, exposed and began to deteriorate the optic nerve for a long time, maybe not reversible. But it was a small percent.
A gentleman that had a question.
Yes, I wanted to know, there's a lot of research that's been done on the effects of caloric deficits at different ages of childhood. And one finding from population registries in Scandinavia was that there may be a benefit to nutritional deficits in around the age of 10 to 13 years, just before puberty was the time period, that manifests itself later on in life in better response to diseases and longevity. Do you know if there's been any studies considering the amount of time that has elapsed in people approaching middle age?
You're talking about caloric restriction, not nutritional deficit, right?
Yeah, it's very
caloric
much so.
restriction, yeah. Well,
Macronutrient deficit.
there's a lot of research in adults, and I think the data is consistent also in non-human primates that reducing your requirement of calories, so consuming about 15 to 20% below your requirement based on your body weight and so on, may prolong the lifespan. But it is at the expense of shrinking your kidneys, shrinking your liver, and many other things that you may not want to happen. So that area became a little bit of a dead end because you are showing a effect that relates strictly to age, not to quality of life necessarily, or performance in times of stress where you need 3 kidneys and you have only, one between the two. So on the other hand, in children it's a little different because that depends a lot on the baseline of the population. We live in a world where obesity is everywhere. In children, the percent of children and adults who have an excess weight is far more than is related to health. So if you restrict this, you are not really changing from health to below. You are, as a population, as an average, you are just reducing the number of people who are overweight. It's a different population experiment than the strict physiological study where you take a healthy person and give them less food than they need. So if you do that with the adolescents, you are going to obviously impact on growth, bone development, muscle development, menarche, and there are plenty of evidence that that is a critical period for energy balance.
I think we're going to have to stop here. Thank you very much, Ben.
I think we should replace Siri on the iPhones and have it be Ask Ben. I would like to invite our Dean, Mike Clegg, to come up and offer some comments. We've continued to have involvement in Cuba, and then we have a few things to give Ben.
Sure. It was a great talk, Ben, and it related so nicely in a way to last year's talk, where I think it was last year that we talked about the famine in Europe. Very similar kinds of issues. So it's great to have Ben back at the school, and to have him here giving the Graham lecture. And he's now a professor emeritus. I met Ben, I can remember well. You don't remember this. It was on the inpatient GCRC at the hospital, and Ben was doing an insulin clamp study, which is a pretty complex physiologic experiment on a human where you infuse insulin into a person, and then you measure how much glucose they consume to maintain a constant blood sugar. So it's pretty sophisticated. It's and then I met him when we were talking about obesity in Siberian Eskimos. Remember Siberian versus Alaska? And I wondered, who is this guy? I mean, on one hand, he does sort of very intense physiologic work, but then he's going up and looking at families that were split, by the Cold War, and looking at obesity. And what he is the model of William Henry Welch. You talked about William Henry Welch, who came to Hopkins, founded the School of Medicine, and came here and founded this school. And he believed that the way to prevent disease was really to understand physiology and do laboratory-based research, and then take that to the community. And in that sense, you're the model of William Henry Welch. I want to say hi to folks who are here. I know your daughter is just leaving, and Martin, thank you for coming, and your wife, and I think there's members of the Graham family here as well. So it's great to welcome you all. Keith said that whether we maintain this link with Cuba. So Ben, I don't think you know this, but last year, about every 2 years, we take our health advisory board somewhere to see public health in action. So about 18, 19 months ago, we got the idea to go to Cuba, and we decided to go to Cuba. We invited the board. We made the arrangements using that license you talked about that Hopkins has. And then Obama announced he was going to try to normalize relations. And everybody on the health advisory board thought we had arranged that for the visit, but we didn't. And we went, and it's interesting. Cuba is a country of contrasts. It's you fly over it, it's totally green, but 97% of the arable land is not farmed. And it's because of the social issues that are going on. But while we were there, we spent a day with Fidel Castro's son, who's a nuclear physicist. And next month, his grandson, Fidel Castro III, is coming to talk at a conference here in MMI. So we still have maintained this link. You know, I said that you are the model of William Henry Welch, and you started out by talking about the history of the school, and I'm going to use that quote about Harvard, about disunity, but to celebrate our centennial and to commemorate your giving this lecture, we do have some gifts, and I don't know where they're hidden. Are they? Do you know where they're hidden? No. Okay, somewhere behind you on the table. Okay. So Ben, maybe we can ask you to come up. So this gift is for you to write to us more. Okay, it's a pen and pencil set from Cross. Okay, but this is something that's we had made for this occasion. So William Henry Welch was the founding dean of both schools, and when in 1910, when he was 60 years old, his friends had a party for him. And what they did as party favors is, well, first they had a large brass bas relief made of him, which hangs right outside the inside the entrance of the school. If you notice on one side, yeah. And then they had party favors made that were copies of that, right? So here's what we had made. We have reproduced that relief of William Henry Welch here on the coin, and it says, you know, founding dean. And on the other side is the symbol that we're using for the centennial of the school. So we wanted to give you this as a memento of giving the Graham lecture this year, during our centennial year. So,
Very much.
Okay. Let me get this. Okay.
This concludes our lecture and begins the reception. So we have a wonderful reception waiting for everyone in the Anna Bacher room. Please join us. Come to the reception and chat and mingle and have some great food. Okay? Thank you very much for coming.